Many people believe that life is priceless, and indeed it is. However, there are also people among us who believe that a bloody execution can be carried out for just a few tens of dollars. At the time of the events in question, Brian and Beverly Moke lived in a small town in Washington State, USA. Their love story began in April 2001 when they first met at a mutual friend's party. From that very first meeting, they realized they couldn't live without each other. Their union seemed so natural to everyone who knew them. Both had been restless since childhood. It seemed as if two tomboys had found each other. Beverly was very active in sports and often competed with boys. Her favorite games weren't dolls but climbing trees and playing baseball with the boys. Brian, on the other hand, was an adventurer with a fearless character. At the age of 3, he nearly drove his parents crazy when he found $1 and crossed a 3-lane highway to buy himself some candy at a store across the street. As they grew older, their lives remained just as intense. They both loved adventures and outdoor activities. When they started dating, they immediately realized they were on the same wavelength. From that moment, their incredible ideas were brought to life together. Their shared love for travel became a favorite hobby. They often traveled to different countries, diving and engaging in other outdoor activities. They even supported the same football team. But despite their deep bond, they weren't in a hurry to get married. First, they wanted to finish their studies and start working. During college, Brian found a job at an air conditioning company and Beverly became a secretary at a car dealership. After finishing her education, Beverly was promoted to engineer. It seemed like the right time to solidify their future with marriage. So, on May 5, 2006, they decided to get married and went on a long trip abroad. Upon returning, they bought a house in a small town in Pennsylvania, a dream come true for both of them. They were inspired by life, not knowing how tragically their story would end. On the morning of November 17, 2007, one of Brian's friends came to visit, as they had planned a hunting trip together. When Brian didn't answer the phone, the friend waited outside for about half an hour. After several failed attempts to reach him, he became upset and went hunting alone. He tried again to contact Brian and Beverly, but no one answered. It felt strange, and his disappointment soon turned into concern. After returning from the hunt, the friend went to their house to check on them. It was unlike Brian and Beverly to be unreachable for so long. When he arrived, he noticed the house was eerily quiet and the lights were still off. He looked through a window and saw something unsettling. A TV had been thrown on the floor. Inside, a horrific scene awaited him. There was a bloody sheet on the floor, and from under it, a human leg was sticking out. The blood had spread across almost the entire floor. Horrified, he called the police. When the officers arrived, they found the couple's bodies. 30-year-old Brian and his 28-year-old wife, Beverly, had been shot. The couple's bodies were found together, covered by a blanket. The crime scene was chaotic, with blood splattered on the walls and floor. After reconstructing the crime, detectives found that each of the victims had 3 gunshot wounds. The bullets were fired from a .22 caliber pistol, and spent cartridges were found in the house, suggesting there was likely one killer. Based on the position of the bodies, it appeared that Brian had opened the door to the killer. He was likely shot in the back, possibly after offering to let the intruder in. Beverly, hearing the shots, probably came out of the bedroom, only to be shot in the back as well. She seemed to have tried to escape but was unsuccessful. After being killed, she was dragged across the floor, leaving a long, bloody trail. The couple's bodies were covered with a blanket, and the blood had unusual marks on it, marks that appeared to have been made by someone trying to clean up, possibly using a broom or a brush. Despite the killer's attempts to cover his tracks, the police found important evidence. The killer's boots had left a pattern on the blanket covering the bodies, which was traced to a rare pair of work boots with a distinctive zigzag tread. Local construction companies were contacted, but no matches were found, meaning the killer had no prior criminal history, or his fingerprints hadn't been recorded. The investigation led the police to interview Brian's friend and others in their circle. It was confirmed that the friend had no involvement, as his whereabouts were verified by security camera footage. The focus then shifted to the couple's neighbors. One neighbor, Daniel Tavares, mentioned hearing gunshots at around 5 a.m. He saw a red pickup truck parked outside the Moke's house. Two men had exited the house and got into the truck, but they were wearing hoods that obscured their faces. The only clear detail was the driver, a white man with long hair tied in a ponytail. The police then began looking for this red pickup truck, but the investigation was still at a standstill, leaving many unanswered questions about the killer's identities. There were no immediate leads, so the search was expanded to a district-wide level. Many red pickup trucks were noted in the area, but none were connected to the crime. Despite these efforts, no valuable leads surfaced until Beverly's mother remembered a conversation from her daughter. She told the police that Beverly had once mentioned a man she found suspicious and even dangerous. Beverly had expressed fear of her 21-year-old neighbor, Jeremy Flynn, who lived nearby. Jeremy had a criminal past, having been arrested multiple times for theft and robbery, though there was no record of violent crimes. He had a bad reputation in the neighborhood, and the authorities began to take a keen interest in him. The police decided to investigate what he had been doing on the day of the murders. Unfortunately, when they visited his home, Jeremy was not there, which fueled further suspicions. The authorities thought he may have fled after the massacre. The investigation took a new turn when the police spoke to people close to Jeremy. They learned that just weeks before the murder, Beverly and Brian had hosted a party at their house. Jeremy had attended, and according to several witnesses, including Beverly's mother, his behavior became increasingly aggressive as he drank. He insulted the guests and even clashed with Brian. Eventually, Brian had to ask Jeremy to leave. This angered Jeremy, who insulted Brian and threatened him before leaving. The next morning, Beverly and Brian discovered that several items had gone missing, including firearms and a mobile phone. They suspected Jeremy, knowing his history with theft, and confronted him at his home. Jeremy denied the accusations and insisted that he had nothing to do with the thefts. The couple decided not to escalate things to the police at that time, but the confrontation left Beverly feeling anxious, especially about being alone in the house. Both she and Brian even considered moving away. Then, by a strange coincidence, they found the pistols outside their house, which they believed Jeremy had planted there. However, the mobile phone was never recovered. Despite these unsettling events, they chose not to report the theft to the authorities. Before Beverly's death, she repeatedly expressed her worries about Jeremy. Even her mother began to have concerns about him, despite never meeting him. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, she became increasingly uneasy. The police continued to focus on Jeremy, but they soon found that none of the pistols recovered from the doorstep matched the murder weapon. Furthermore, Jeremy did not own a red pickup truck, nor did he resemble the description of the person Daniel Tavares had provided. When they finally found Jeremy and brought him in for questioning, he had a solid alibi. On the night of the murders, he had been at a party in another city with friends, and he stayed there for several days. His alibi was confirmed by multiple witnesses, and further checks showed purchases made on his credit card in that city, along with CCTV footage from local businesses. This effectively cleared Jeremy of any involvement. Despite being ruled out as a suspect, Jeremy cooperated fully with the investigation. He was calm, provided fingerprints, and even voluntarily shared everything he knew about the situation. There was no evidence to link him to the crime. The authorities, however, remained cautious. They also found that Jeremy did not work for the construction company that was supposedly responsible for supplying the boots found near the crime scene. The investigation continued with a focus on Daniel Tavares, who had allegedly witnessed the criminals leaving the scene. His testimony, however, began to unravel. Daniel had initially given a vague description of the perpetrators, but as time went on he became more specific, claiming to have seen scars and specific marks on their faces. One of the detectives, however, realized that Daniel's account was inconsistent with what could have been observed from the distance and darkness at the time of the crime. When Daniel was questioned again, he provided an inconsistent account. His shoes also did not match the tread marks found in the victim's house, and his background raised further suspicions. It turned out that Daniel had a lengthy criminal history, including charges for robbery, drug possession, and violent behavior. His most notable crime was the manslaughter of his mother, for which he served 16 years in prison before being released. During his time in prison, Daniel had met Jennifer Freitas through an online dating site, and after his release, they married. However, Daniel violated his parole by leaving Massachusetts without informing his parole officer, a detail the authorities had overlooked in the early stages of the investigation. His work history also became a point of interest. Daniel had recently quit a construction job, a job that provided boots similar to those found near the crime scene. Jennifer, Daniel's wife, also came under suspicion. She appeared nervous during police questioning, and her relationship with Daniel raised red flags. She had a history of using dating apps, and it was alarming that she married a man with Daniel's violent background. Police began to suspect that both Daniel and Jennifer might be involved in the double murder. The investigation shifted towards Daniel, who was now considered a prime suspect. During questioning, he behaved nervously and eventually admitted to having visited Brian and Beverly multiple times before the murders. He claimed that he had a warm relationship with the couple, but the detectives were skeptical of his behavior. When the topic of a palm print found at the crime scene was mentioned, Daniel became visibly anxious, and the detectives seized the opportunity. A subtle change in strategy allowed police to collect Daniel's palm prints. While they were being analyzed, Daniel continued to provide further details about the crime. His story about the killings became more elaborate and contradictory. Eventually, the prints matched those found at the crime scene. The shoe prints left at the victim's house were also a perfect match to the ones Daniel was wearing when he was brought in for questioning. On November 24, 2007, Daniel Tavares was arrested and charged with the double murder of Brian and Beverly. The victims were buried a day later, and many mourners attended their funeral. The investigation continued, but Daniel's actions showed that he had likely killed before. In 2015, another investigation opened when skeletal remains were found in Daniel's childhood home. They were identified as belonging to his former neighbor, Gail Botelho, who had gone missing years before. Daniel confessed to killing Gail after a dispute over money owed for drugs. He had hidden her body in his yard. Daniel was convicted of another murder and received another life sentence. Investigators believe that Daniel's violent tendencies were likely responsible for more deaths than were previously known. His emotional instability and aggression made him a dangerous individual capable of murder over trivial matters. Future investigations may reveal even more about his criminal history. Thank you for watching.